eRide Pro has made some big updates to their fleet in 2025, and today I'm going to unbox the eRide Pro S and show you guys the new updates that they have on this smaller, beginner-sized model. The eRide Pro S is a great beginner bike, and if this is your first time owning an e-moto, it may seem a little bit daunting to get this thing unboxed and built, but we're gonna take you through how to do that today. It's actually quite simple. Just follow these steps and you can be out riding in no time. So first thing I always start with is installing the handlebars while the bike is still on the box. That way your handlebars aren't dangling around and they don't get scratched up in the process of trying to get this bike off. So we'll go ahead and use a 5mm Allen to take off the stem bolts. Now that I've got the stem bolts off, I can go ahead and get ready to install the handlebars. But before I do that, I'm gonna take a 3mm Allen and loosen off the light switch so that I can slide it over the handlebars. So we'll get that loose. Then we'll also loosen off the throttle bolts, which is a 4mm Allen. Then you can take your light switch, slide that on the handlebar, take your throttle, slide that over the handlebar. You can leave those loose for now, but then you can put the handlebars back in place using that 5mm Allen and those stem bolts. We can go ahead and line up these handlebars, get them nice and centered. I usually like to put this bottom line to where it's just barely covered and you can't see it, and then make sure that you're even on both sides of the handlebars. And then you can go ahead and tighten them down. Try to tighten these down as evenly as possible, both up and down, so there's a nice gap on both sides of the handlebar. Next thing we can do is put the throttle in the correct place. So you'll take and slide your throttle all the way over onto the handlebar, but the end of the rubber here will be touching the handlebar, so barely back it off. Once you back that off, make sure that your cable is pointing directly straight down, and use that 4mm Allen to tighten both sides of this down. Like so. And then make sure that when you twist the throttle, there's no sort of friction or binding. It should be extremely smooth and snap back into place. Next, you'll want to take your front brake and do the same thing. We'll go ahead and get this installed. So using that 4mm Allen, let's go ahead and loosen off both of these brake mounts. Go ahead and put this back on the handlebar, put those bolts back on. This only needs to be roughly in place right now. I am going to show you how to properly align things so that it's a very comfortable riding experience for you. But in the meantime, let's just put them in a place where they won't move. And after that, we'll go ahead and tighten things down all the way. Now we can get ready. Now the handlebars are roughly in place, we can get ready to take this bike off of the actual crate. So I'm gonna go ahead and loosen these straps. Loosen one side, and then this other side is gonna pop up quite dramatically because there is tension on these forks right now. So just be ready for that to pop up, like so. Pull these straps out. Next step will be to loosen the axle, pull it out of the box so we can get ready to move this bike onto a stand. To take this axle off, use a 5mm to loosen the pinch bolts. There are 4 pinch bolts in total, and then an 8mm Allen to loosen the side axle nuts. The side axle nut on this bike is already quite loose, so I'm just gonna go ahead and pull that all the way out. Then I'll loosen off all 4 pinch bolts. Now this part's quite a bit easier with 2 people, but you'll basically want to take tension off of these forks and push this axle all the way through so that it comes out of this axle block, and then the front end will be released from the box. Now that the front end of this bike is released from the box, you can go ahead and move this over to a stand. This part is also a lot easier with 2 people. The bike is a little bit heavy, but you can go ahead and just lift it right up and move it over to the stand. Now the bike's on a stand, it is ready to install the rest of the components. First thing I'm going to start with is the front end. Let's go ahead and get into the accessories box and show you everything that the E-Ride Pro S comes with. All right, first box that we got here is the charger for the bike. Go ahead and get this opened up. Here's your charger. Charger is very straightforward. It is one directional when you go ahead and plug it into the bike. I'll show you how to plug that in real quick. If you're eager to get riding, getting this battery charged as soon as possible is probably what you want to do. So before we install the rest of the parts on the bike, let's go ahead and take this battery out. You'll take your keys, put it in the side latch, lift up your battery lid. Here, you'll find the battery is already plugged in with this new style connector that they have on this. It is a little bit tricky, but you just go ahead and pull it straight out. Make a little bit of room and try to get this pulled out of the way. At that point, you can just pull the battery straight out of the bike. Now that the battery's out of the bike, you'll find here on the left side that you can remove this little cap, and it's the charging port for the bike. Like I said, it is one directional, so make sure that you align the push button with the pins on this side. Go ahead and just push that straight on. You'll hear a click. That is in place. Once this is plugged into a wall, the charger will begin charging. You can just let that go and we can get back to installing the rest of the bike. This can also be charged while the battery is in the bike. There is access to the side port, so you don't have to worry about pulling the battery totally out of the bike to get it charging. Just a lot easier to do this now, so you can go ahead and put it back in right after and get riding. Now we've got the accessories box that came with the bike. We'll go ahead and get this opened up. And in here, you're gonna find all the parts needed to put everything back together. So first thing, I've got the front number plate for the bike. On the bike, there was also a front fender, as well as a rear shock hugger. Set those out of the way for now. This is an extra battery tray dampener. There should already be one installed on the bike, but if this wears out, you've just got some extras there you can go ahead and put on the battery tray that sits below the battery. This comes with an E-Ride Pro S owner's manual that also shows you how to install everything on this bike, like I will be doing in the video here today. We will go over this display later. It shows you everything that you need to know about the bike while you're riding it. E-Ride Pro also provides a bunch of tools for you to install everything onto this bike. We'll open up this packaging here. These are your foot pegs. These foot pegs are already attached to the foot peg mounts. To install these on the bike, you're going to use a 17mm socket and go ahead and put these on. I'll show you how to do that here shortly. So it comes with both your right and your left foot peg. E-Ride Pro provides a bunch of zip ties as well. This is great for installing things like your number plate, as well as organizing a bunch of the wires that will sit underneath the number plate. In this box are also 2 front wheel spacers. You'll install these into the hub of the wheel, and then you can put the wheel on the bike. And then there's some accessory bolts in here. A lot of these are extras. These are for the shock. Those are 2 extra shock washers. These are 2 extra nuts for the foot peg mounts. And then these 3 bolts here are for the front fender. You'll want to put Loctite on these bolts before installing it onto the bike. We're gonna get ready to install the front wheel onto this bike. So I'm gonna go ahead and install those spacers now. I'm gonna cut this zip tie here that's protecting the rotor bolts. And then take these spacers, they've got little O-rings on the edge. You simply just kind of plop them in, give them a little twist, make sure they're sitting flush. Put one on each side of the wheel, and this is ready to install into the bike. Before I install that front wheel, I'm gonna take my zip ties and a snip, and I'm gonna get all of these wires organized into a nice place. So I'm gonna take these wires, and you'll wanna make sure that they sit behind the number plate here. So I'm gonna take and throw a zip tie around these wires here. I like to do one up top. Now I do not put these 3 wires onto the brake cable. I make sure those stay separate there. I also like to make sure that all these wires are running in the same fashion with each other. So we can put those there. Keep in mind, it's very important to have this front brake cable be completely out of the way and in front of everything else. I'm gonna take this rear brake cable, I'm gonna set it behind this light. I'm gonna take all these other cables and also put them behind the headlight here. I'm gonna move that headlight up into position. Take another zip tie. Put one there on those wires. And I'll put one down here to hold all these wires together. Take my snippers and clean up those zip ties. Now the cables are organized much better. There is one wire back here that is still loose. This is going to go to the display. So your display is going to sit here on the handlebars, and you're going to feed that wire down and plug it into here. So let's go ahead and take our display as well as a 3mm Allen. Take these bolts completely out of the display here. And then you can stretch the display plastic out over the handlebar and set it onto the bike. So make sure that your wire is facing up front. Stretch it out. Goes right down like that. Then you can take those bolts that you took out, put them back in place, and secure this display onto the handlebars. And now I can take and actually install this display into the wiring. There's an arrow on both ends of this wiring here. I'm gonna make sure that I feed it behind these cables. Make sure that nothing's getting impeded. And while I'm down here, I can find those arrows, line them up, and plug this into each other. Now that all my cables are organized and my wiring is done, I can go ahead and put the front number plate on the bike. You use 4 zip ties to do this. Make sure your front brake cable sits in front of the number plate here, and go ahead and put that on and zip tie around it. Once those zip ties are in place, I'm gonna go ahead and clean them up with some wire cutters. And then move the sharp edge of that zip tie back behind the number plate. Now when you turn the handlebars, you shouldn't have any sort of restrictions with wires. Everything should be running really smooth. Now there's a couple really common problems that I see on these e-bikes, mainly with this front brake wiring. Oftentimes I see people put it behind the number plate. That's a major problem. I also see the cable getting routed to the outside. Teleria in particular does this. That is very dangerous because it can snag on something if it's routed outside. E-Ride already did this correctly, so I don't need to change that. Now another really common issue I see is in regards to this cable guide here. Oftentimes as the fork goes through the travel, it does not freely flow through that cable guide, and often creates a kink right here on the bottom. So I typically just completely remove this cable guide. It is a 3mm Allen. Just go ahead and take that all the way off. That way this cable is really free floating. Cable guides are good when they're done properly, but this is such a small hole holding that really it's hard for that cable to flow freely through this, so I just remove it and get rid of that issue. Now we're ready to install the front fender on this bike. Like I mentioned earlier, it comes with 3 front fender bolts. I put Loctite on these bolts and they are 4mm Allens. So we'll just go ahead and put these in. There's 3 holes underneath this triple clamp. Pretty straightforward. Just go ahead and make sure that you don't cross thread and get those bolts up into that triple clamp. Loctite is very important on these bolts because there's a lot of vibration that goes through the front end and these bolts come loose easily without them. So get all 3 of those in place, get them nice and tightened down. And then we're ready to install the front wheel. Now to install the front wheel, I'm going to remove the spacer that's in between the brake pads. That is where the rotor will go. And I'm also going to put a thin layer of grease on this front axle. The grease I typically use is the Maxima waterproof grease. This works incredibly for a long period of time. Just take a very thin layer of that, just put it right onto the axle there. Set that off to the side and you're ready to put the front wheel on the bike. Now I'll put this front wheel in, slide the rotor into the brake pads, take my axle and slide it through the fork leg, line it up with the other side, push it all the way through. Then I'll take my other axle nut and put it onto the axle. And then utilizing 2 8mm Allen keys, I'll put one on each side of the axle nuts and then tighten those together. Just get those nice and snug. Now I'm going to tighten down the pinch bolts for the axle. Highly recommend using a torque wrench and torquing it to 7 Newton meters. To tighten these, you tighten one side down, and then move to the other side. And then you'll go back and forth. So once I get this to spec, then I'll move to the other side. Get that one, then I'll move back, and you keep doing this until both sides are completely snug. Like so, and then you do that on the other side of the axle as well. Now that the front end is good, I can go ahead and install this rear shock. So I'm going to take the bolt that came on the shock out. One side of this bolt is a 6mm Allen, the other side is a 13mm socket. So go grab those tools. And then I'm also going to put a very thin layer of grease on this bolt here. Then I can line up the shock. Slide the bolt through. Put the nut on the other end. Go ahead and get those tightened together. And snug them down. Now that the shock's in place, I can install this rear shock hugger. To do so, I'm going to take a 4mm Allen and loosen off the 4 bolts. There's 2 on each side. Then you stretch this over the top of those mounts. Once that's stretched over the top, you can go ahead and reinstall these bolts here. Just get them aligned. Be careful not to cross thread. And then do the 2 other bolts on the other side. We are just about there. Last step is going to be to install the foot peg onto the bike. This is a 17mm socket. Go ahead and take that nut off. Install this right into the center. There's going to be a couple of holes that these pins line up with. You want to be sure that when you install these, your foot pegs will flick backwards. If they don't flick backwards, then it's on the wrong side. It's very important that happens because if you strike a rock and this doesn't move, then you can break a lot of components on this frame. So then I'll take that nut, put it through the other side. Take my 17mm socket and go ahead and tighten this down. Then we just repeat that same process on the other side of the bike. Now that you got your bike built and your battery charged, let's go ahead and show you how to put this battery back in the bike and get it fired up. So we'll open up this battery lid again, pull our cables up and out of the way. Now, a couple of extremely important things to consider. You want to make sure that this breaker is off. If it's facing left and it's green, that means it's off. If it's facing right and it's red, that means that it's on. So be sure to keep that off. And then something else that's kind of cool is these bikes come with a limiter. So the eRide Pro SS 2.0 and the eRide Pro S both have these limiters in them. If you want to unlock this bike to its fullest potential, you simply just unplug this black looped piece, push down on that clip. Now this bike is completely unlocked. So with the cables up and out of the way, I can slide this battery into the bike. Take your battery, slide it down into place. This cable you can just tuck back underneath here. This is your power cable. Once again, make sure that your breaker is turned to the off position and slide this in. Just push it straight on. And this is the communication cable. This is one directional, just like the battery charging cable. Just go ahead and plug that in, tuck that cable back. And now that that's all plugged in, you can go ahead and turn on your breaker, flip that over, close your battery lid. Now that your breaker is flipped back on, the bike is ready to fire up. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the key in. I'm gonna remove this covering so you can actually see the display. When you turn your key to the first position, which is the middle position, it activates the battery and it turns on the USB charging ports that are located under here. You've got a USB-C charging port and a USB charging port. Those will now be activated. And then when you turn the key to the second position, the bike fires completely on and you'll see that display come to life. Now that the display is on, you're gonna see quite a few different things on it. The eRide Pro S now shows the motor, the controller, and the battery temperature here on the display, which is super cool to see. It has got an eco and a sport mode that is switched with a hand switch on your left over here. It shows your battery percentage. It shows what time of day it is. It has got two trips, a trip A and a trip B, and an odometer. In the center here, you've got your miles per hour. When the bike moves, you'll see that change. To go through the functions of the display, there are 3 buttons on the side here. If you click the lower button or hold that down, it'll come into a My Vehicle setting, which shows you a bunch of different information here on the display. You can change the brightness of the display itself. You can change what time of day it is. You can change the unit from imperial to metric if you'd like. You can also change language from Chinese, English, and Spanish. You can choose your wheel size. This bike actually comes with 16-inch wheels, so I'm gonna go ahead and move that over and select 16-inch. And then you can also select your gear ratio, and then it shows you what firmware is on the bike, and then you can just let the display time out and come back to the riding position. Here on the left side, you've got your eco and sport mode. You've also got the 3 different regen settings. Center is off, 1 is mild, 2 is quite a bit. There is a turbo button here on this bike. That turbo button works for a brief period of time, and then there's also a horn. That horn is very loud. On the right side of the handlebars, you've got your throttle, as well as a light switch. So now your eRide Pro S is set up and ready to ride. But let's go over a couple of the specs on this bike because a few things have changed from previous year models. So previously this bike had 17-inch wheels. It now has 16-inch wheels with a huge 3.25 by 16 tire that is a great hybrid option and honestly provides a lot of stability for this bike both on and off-road. Really cool to see that. I think that is a great update. And that also means that because you already have a 16-inch rear, if you would like to go to a more traditional moto setup, you can just install a 19-inch front wheel, which are super easy to come by in the e-moto world. So now you've got a 16-19 setup if you'd like it very easily, but it's super cool that they went with 16-inch front and rear on this bike. I think it's really nice for keeping this platform quite a bit lower for beginner riders. This bike also has KKE suspension on it, and this is some of the better KKE suspension that comes from the factory, mainly because it is not separate fork function suspension, which means in both sides you've got springs and dampers, which is super nice. You've got a preload adjustment on the top of both sides, as well as rebound adjustment on the top of both sides, and then on the lower portion of both legs you've got a compression adjustment. On the rear end, you've got compression on top, rebound down low, and a preload adjustment by changing the ride height of the spring. So really nice adjustable suspension on this bike. Other than that, the only other change that they really made was a thicker and stronger jack shaft axle for this bike. But that's pretty much it. It is very similar to last year's model. This bike still sits at 6 kilowatts, which is a great beginner-friendly number that competes with the 2024 and older Sur-Ron Light Bs. So this bike coming in at a great price point for a nice beginner bike, I think is all around a really good package. And I really like that the biggest change that they made on this bike was the wheels. That is a really nice change for this smaller size E-Ride Pro S. If you guys have any questions about this bike or want me to go more in depth on specific things, please let me know in the comments. I can go ahead and take you through anything that you guys would like to in a future video. If you liked this setup video, please hit subscribe. It goes a really long way in allowing us to make content for you. But thank you guys for watching a video about the new 2025 E-Ride Pro S.